A very important event took place not too far from here, just to the south of us in Arkansas. I'm sure you've heard about environmentalists that are trying very hard to persuade President Obama to not approve of the construction of the Keystone XL Pipeline, which will cross some of our nation's largest and most important aquifers. It's a bad idea in lots of ways to build this pipeline, not the least of which is that the demand for oil products is bound to go down as new resources of natural gas are becoming much and much more accessible to us. And tar sand, from which this particular oil is taken, is the most polluting form of oil available. Still, oil companies can make a lot of money by extracting the tar sands out of Canada, shipping it across our water sources, and then putting it in the Gulf Coast where there's lots and lots of tankers. They say somehow this is supposed to reduce our oil costs, but the reason to have a pipeline is to get it out of America and ship it to markets in Europe. So that by doing it this way, we take all the risk of spills, then we clean it up in our Gulf where we get to keep the toxins and then ship the oil to other markets. Yet in the midst of this debate, I don't know how this is a debate, but it's a debate. In the midst of this, there was a break in a pipeline that already exists in Arkansas that is carrying the same tar sands. Tar sands are much more toxic, much more dangerous than sweet light crude oil. But it is not regulated under the same laws as crude oil. It is less regulated. It's more dangerous, but it is less regulated. It's less regulated because it's more dangerous. Because that, if it were regulated as tightly as crude oil, you really wouldn't want to touch it. So by manipulating the laws so that it's regulated not as oil, but as coal slurry, as liquefied coal, it escapes the kinds of regulations it would otherwise be expected to have. Now, we are being given assurances by Exxon that wants to build this pipeline that we should forget about the spill in the Gulf a couple of years ago. We should forget about their oil tanker spill in Alaska a few years ago. And we should believe that they are prepared to be really, really responsible with the Keystone XL Pipeline, if only they were allowed to build it. And then there's this in Arkansas, which you don't hear much about. The spill took place in Mayflower, Arkansas, just about a month ago. And we discovered in that spill that Exxon had no detection equipment to indicate that the oil was spilling out of their pipeline. You'd think they would have controls to know when the pressure went down or that the oil was being spilled. They didn't. You know how Exxon found out that they were spilling oil? A guy was getting ready to have a birthday party for his 8-year-old daughter in the backyard and saw a tide of black crud coming his way, and he called 911 and said, "I don't know what it is or where it is coming from, but it's coming down the road at my house." You've not heard much about it because Exxon hired the off-duty sheriff's deputies to guard the site, and they are not allowing reporters into the site of the spill, which could sound kind of like typical Arkansas bribe-based politics until you find out that the reason that the networks aren't at least flying their news helicopters over it and giving us some images of the spill is because the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, declared it to be a no-fly zone. And they did the same thing over the Exxon spill in the Gulf a couple of years ago. The federal government is assisting the oil industry in suppressing media coverage of a major environmental disaster. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but I have watched a lot of episodes of Law and Order. And I think that allowing the criminal to control the crime scene is kind of unusual. Reporters who've tried to get on the site have been told by the police that they would be arrested and jailed on the charge of criminal trespass. I'll tell you honestly, friends, I never dreamed I would see this in America. We've said all my life that possession is 9/10 of the law. People used to say that to emphasize the sanctity of personal ownership of property. But I realize that the saying is true. Possession is 9/10 of the law because the people who own everything write the laws. That is why possession is 9/10 of the law. The rules are written by the wealthy and powerful to serve the interests of, surprise, surprise, the wealthy and the powerful. If you went into a city park here in Springfield, opened a quart of oil and poured it on the grass, you would be in trouble. You would get in big trouble for that. If, however, you are an oil company and you spill 100 million gallons of toxic tar sands on the ground, then you are likely to get a tax break and federal subsidies to go out and find some more tar sand. Now, I'm just a preacher. I'm not a government expert or an environmental engineer or even an economist. But in the prophetic faith tradition, I believe that it is up to us as a prophetic church community to call foul on this one. This is an instance in which we must be willing to speak the truth to power to defend the environment. Being prophetic, of course, has nothing to do with predicting the distant future. The prophets spoke truth to power because power will almost always exploit the weak for economic gain. We have for years in this country made fun of the Soviets and the Chinese for their bureaucratic governments, so rife with corruption. We have objected to aid to Central and South American countries because their governments are so corrupt. The aid never gets to the intended site because it's always siphoned off by corrupt politicians. But what I've learned about government corruption is about the same thing that I learned about petty criminals. If you're going to steal, steal big. Steal so big that no one can tell what you're stealing. What is, after all, robbing a bank, in which case people usually get $8,000 or $10,000, compared to owning a bank? I mean, if you look at those two together, which one is the bigger thief? You consider these payday loan operations that we have in our state that charge the poor over 400% on a short-term loan. And when they can't pay it back, they have to take out another loan to pay it, and by the time they've layered that up by 3 times, they are paying over 1,900% interest. And that is legal. Why is that legal? Because the banks write the rules. And the banks, where people like you and me get our mortgages and get our car loans, set up payday loan businesses that they then use to extract a percentage rate you wouldn't dream of paying from the people who can afford to pay it the least. So you get someone who takes a $500 loan to keep from being evicted, and over the next 3 years they pay back $6,000. And they didn't have enough money to keep from getting evicted in the first place. So now they're evicted and in debt, with debt collectors following them everywhere they go. Sometimes, men and women, the laws are wrong. Sometimes the laws are bad. Sometimes the rules are written for bad reasons to serve greedy people. Capitalism is, in a way, its own religion. It is a religion that requires you to have enough faith to believe that if they are left unregulated, that the most greedy and powerful people in the world will eventually do the right thing for the most weak and impoverished people in the world. And in light of that, I'm going to have to say that that is a religion that requires more faith than I have ever been able to muster. Our scripture lesson today is a familiar miracle story from the Gospel of John. It's a story that, if you read it literally, presumes that you're willing to accept a number of magical assumptions. First being that there's a pool of water in Jerusalem that from time to time is disturbed for no visible reason. One textual edition said that an angel comes and disturbs it. Presumably there was a spring of water that fed it from underneath, so occasionally the water would appear to bubble and move on its own. But the myth around it was that the first person that got in the water after the water was disturbed could experience miraculous healing. Now, some poor guy who couldn't walk had been lying by the pool for over 30 years. He couldn't get in it. Healing was right there where he could see it, but he couldn't get into it. He couldn't get there while the magic was still hot. There's always some kid with acne that jumped in first, or there was some husband that threw his wife in that said that she had headaches all the time before he could get someone to help him to get into the water. So Jesus walks in on the scene. He sees the lame man. He understands that he can see healing but can't get it, and so Jesus heals him. Now, if you're inclined to read John the way they taught us to read it in Sunday school, you're supposed to say, Jesus must be God because he can heal people like that. And of course, you didn't see it yourself, you just read it in the Bible. So as soon as you got out of Sunday school and walked out into the daylight, you forgot all about it because it didn't mean anything to you at all. You didn't see it. But if you're willing to read these accounts as being what John says they are, because John says they are signs, perhaps not to be taken literally as history, but to be read for their meaning. What is the meaning of it? What is it a sign of? If it's a metaphor, what is the point? And here we have a mythical source of healing. Let's just say in this story, we've got a mythical source of healing. Let's call it a hospital. And you have a poor guy who needs to get in, but he can't get in because the rules are written in such a way that he can't get in. The sickest guy can't get in. You may have heard some mythic stories like this, like if you're sick, you can't get a job, and most people get insurance at a job, so if you're sick and you can't work, you don't have a job, so you can't get health care. Or if you've got an illness that means that you need medical care, then in this myth we call it a pre-existing condition, so you can't get insurance, so you can't get health care. So we have constructed a healthcare delivery system that intentionally and purposefully makes sure that the people who need it the most can't have it. And that is why in America, more money is spent on breast implants than is spent on Alzheimer's research. The people who wrote the rules for us to charge over $1 million for a round of chemo in the United States that would cost the exact same drug, exact same regimen, would cost less than $2,000 in India. And ironically, the doctor that would take care of you for $1 million or the doctor that would take care of you for $2,000 are brothers that went to the same medical school. Go figure. So if you look at this healing by the hospital or the pool of water as a metaphor, then we see here a prophetic figure who, in the name of God, is not willing for the most sick person in the waiting room to go without treatment while the others get Botox injections in their wrinkled faces and stomach staple surgery because they just can't stay away from the all-you-can-eat cashew chicken buffet line. Now, you can read this as a miracle, and what it means if you read it that way is that in a country far, far away, in a time long, long ago, there was magic. You can't have it, but there was. If I were a great preacher now, I'd probably just stop, sit down, and be quiet, let you stew on these two choices of how to read it. But I really never wanted to be a great success in a field filled with mediocrity, so I'm going to go on. I see this as a sign of the way the followers of the teachings of Jesus are to break the chains that are forged by the powerful that keep sick people from getting medical treatment. I see this as a sign of how we are to prophetically change the system that continues to favor banks over homeowners, that favors coal and oil industries over people who have to breathe air and drink water, and challenge a government that's willing to place air and water at risk for a temporary profit, or even give a lawsuit immunity to Monsanto so that they can experiment with modifying such things as rice, wheat, soybeans, and corn, without which most of the people in the world will die. And that, my friends, is what I believe biblical preaching is supposed to be about. Reading the Bible for miracle stories so that you can find out about magic that happened long, long ago in a place far, far away is like going to a restaurant and eating the menu. There is power in our faith tradition if we quit trying to dress up the lions in organ grinder monkey suits to make them look silly. I understand that to read the Bible the way I'm suggesting might lead a lot of people to not accept social norms so that you will not fit into the way that people run our nation. And that, frankly, is what I'm hoping for.
Good.